Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, The Opportunity for Governance Standards, and we are really happy to have you with us today. I'm Debbie Singizer, and I'm the Director of Board Services here at Vermont School Boards Association. So for those of you who may be hearing about the governance standards for the very first time today, I want to help you by putting them into some context. The governance standards that we will be looking at in just a few minutes are part of the Vermont Agency of Education's District Quality Standards Rule Series 100. They were adopted earlier this summer and they go into effect on July 1st, 2025. You will find the official adopted version of the District Quality Standards on the AOE's website. And we will also have it posted as a handout to this webinar once we get it up on our website so that you can see the document in its entirety. For our purposes today, we will be focusing only on the governance standards, section 113, which you will be seeing in just a few minutes. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce to you our two guest presenters who will be walking us through these governance standards today. Phil Gore, who really needs no introduction because most, if not all of you, know him. Until late last winter, Phil was me, or maybe I was Phil. I'm not sure which one. But in any case, Phil is my predecessor here at the Vermont School Boards Association. He is now the Chief Learning Officer at the Idaho School Boards Association in Boise, Idaho. Last year, Phil served on the task force that was charged by the AOE with drafting the governance standards. So welcome back, and thank you, Phil, for joining us today. Mark Koenig, another person who most, if not all of you know already, is a member of the Addison Northwest School District and is the Addison Regional Representative to the Vermont School Boards Association. Mark does a lot for public education in Vermont, both at the district and state levels. Mark also served on the task force that I mentioned and actually chaired it. So thank you also, Mark, for joining us to discuss the new governance standards with us today. Very quickly, this is our agenda for today. We'll first start with a little bit of background, including the adoption process of the district quality standards. Then we will go right into the governance standards themselves and look at the three buckets or categories of standards. We also have some questions for your board to consider related to these standards. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Actually, there's probably going to be a lot of time for Q&A today. So I'm going to hand the baton off to Mark.
Thank you. So this all began, as I think probably all of you are aware, there was a weighting study changing the formula. The state legislature went through and passed new ordinances regarding how we're going to deal with weighting. Buried within that statute was a request that AOE put together some standards. And as you saw in an earlier slide, there was business operations, facilities, which also includes safety, and then governance standards for boards. AOE reached out to VSBA and said, hey, do you guys want to take the first swing at trying to figure out what these standards might be? VSBA said, yes, thank you. Put together a group of board members from across the state. At the time I chaired this, I was actually not on the VSBA. I just was a known entity. And we had about a dozen board members across Vermont that were interested in trying to figure out what some standards might be for having a board that runs efficiently and effectively. We met 4 times. We presented our findings to AOE. AOE made a couple of minor changes. I think 3 changes, 2 of them were punctuation. Put that off to the state, and over the summer, the state ratified the standards, which are now available on AOE's website. So that's the background. That's where it all came from. Bill, you want to add anything?
No, I think that was a great introduction, Mark, and probably important that Secretary French gave us some initial kind of parameters for what he was looking for. Trying to remember if we called that a charge or whatever, but he met with the task force at the very first meeting and kind of let us know what he was looking for, and we did our best to meet those expectations, ethically and with integrity. So maybe not a big surprise they didn't change much, but I think it's good that they didn't.
So the task force gathered once we met first in person, and then a couple of, we're getting an echo now. Maybe there was some Zooms, and then we met at the annual meeting. Our fourth meeting was at the annual VSBA VSA meeting last October. We set out what we all thought was governance. What was interesting that all the participants pretty much were within the same mindset of what we were looking for, and our general thoughts were to get just. I don't know why I'm getting echoes.
We're not hearing it, Mark.
I am. I'll forget it then. That we were going to give very broad brushstrokes to boards. We didn't want to come in and say, you must meet and discuss such and such every third Monday of January, and you must talk about it for 15 minutes. We just wanted to have boards get a good overview of the different ways that they could be operating to be as effective as possible. And so that was sort of our own charge within what Secretary French was looking for. And he also was just looking for very broad brushstrokes, very easy ways for boards to look at this and think, how does this fit into how we do business?
The task force worked really hard to find that balance between what would be inclusive statements that every single school board in the state, regardless of the configuration, supervisory union, supervisory district, local board, that every board in the state could find themselves located in, and particularly those practicing policy governance or other specific forms of their governance structure, that, this wouldn't marginalize or affect them adversely. And then, as Mark was saying, trying to balance that inclusiveness, broadness, with, well, what does the research say actually makes a difference when it comes to school boards' work and how it affects students. It was a very rewarding exercise. I'm sorry if I cut you off there, Mark. I didn't.
No, I was just going to say, if we want to move on to the first slide, unless anybody has questions about how we all came to be here. But we broke governance down into three buckets. The first being priorities. And the way we structured it was sort of a one-sentence mission or vision statement of what we were talking about by priorities. And then a couple of subsections about the types of things that a board should be trying to do in relation to that bucket. So in this case, we have priorities, which is just really figuring out your vision and setting goals and figuring out big pictures, the things you do that are going to make your students' lives better. And the four things we have here, the graying is just so that you can see better, break up a lot of words. So there's nothing important about subsection 1 and subsection 3. Involve your communities, set goals, review your goals, have your administration and teachers approach the board during meetings to tell you how students are doing, and make sure you're evaluating your superintendent. That's your one employee. So you should be setting goals with your superintendent and then double checking, seeing how that goes. Most of the time we've said at least annually. So that's a good thing to do once a year. If you want to do it more often, my board, the Addison Northwest, we monitor student academic progress throughout the year. We have different aspects of student progress brought to us by people within our district to give us reports pretty much every month we meet. But then that's up to you. That's the way we do it. This is something that allows the flexibility, though, for a board to figure out, well, how do you want to set a measurable goal? How do you want to evaluate your superintendent? Is up to you. It's just important to actually do those things in some structure. But all of these things are helpful to the reason school districts and school boards exist is you want your students to achieve academic success. And all of these things should help you towards that goal.
It might be worth just underscoring on the subject of governance priorities. The task force met with education researcher Ivan Lorentzen. A few of you know that Ivan wrote chapter 4 in this book on improving school board effectiveness. Ivan's research 10 years ago in the state of Montana showed a highly significant relationship between the board evaluating the superintendent on academic performance or student achievement goals as part of the evaluation and the likelihood that student achievement was improving. So we wanted to get at that in that fourth bullet point here without being overly prescriptive. But the task force did review quite a bit of research. In fact, some task force members sought out their own and read multiple documents that we shared. And again, clarity on what the board's priorities are really is square one when it comes to continuous improvement. And so that's how this got to be sort of the first area of the governance standards. Those clear shared priorities that the board and superintendent have talked about in advance. And then as Mark was talking about, it's not just enough to say, well, this is what our priorities are. What do you do with those priorities? Are they part of the ongoing conversation? Are they monitored throughout the year in a way that shows that, yes, this really matters? And that first one, interestingly, this is very new research on the community input into the vision and goals for the school system, where we found in other states that boards that incorporate the community in the development of vision and goals are systems that tend to be not only improving in achievement overall, but closing achievement gaps. And so that's just something I think we should highlight in our minds, the importance of including the community in the board's work. This isn't about, including the community in visiting schools or volunteering in classrooms, but actually at the governance level, the board being intentional to reach out to the community and invite a conversation with them about what their hopes and dreams are for the school system and what they would like to see improved.
So, want to go to 2, or should we dive deeper into this, do you think, Phil?
Well, unless there's a question, we might go to the next area of the standards, and then we can come back to this at the end if there's all.
So second was our protocols. And this is how you do the things you do on a day-to-day basis for the board. So making sure that you know what you think of yourselves as a board. You should be assessing your own performance. And one of the things that we'll probably send out is just a standard feedback survey that you might give to your own board members, saying, how are we doing within our own policies? How are we doing with community development? How are we doing with our budgeting, our finance? And see where you personally think your board is heading. Another thing is to figure out that what you've done in the previous section, how is that actually working? So you've set some goals, you've set some ideas of how you want to achieve. Follow up on that. What are the things you've done as a board resulted in? Figure out whether or not, go ahead.
But yeah, sorry, there's just a little delay, so I'm not sure when to jump in. But the 2 areas that are extremely important for a board to think about and consider on an ongoing basis One is, are we modeling the behavior that we want to see happen throughout our school system? And, that's in the classroom with kids, on the playground, it's with teachers, it's on field trips and sporting events. The kinds of behaviors that we would like to see, the norms and protocols, if you will, for our children, the board needs to make sure it's in line with that. Interestingly, here in Idaho, I just met with our executive director of our cities association this morning, who's been very involved nationally in a civility pledge for cities, counties, and for legislatures. I'm very impressed with her work, and she's going to be doing some work with us in this state for school boards to have a civility pledge. This is how we talk with each other. This is how we model that kind of behavior that we would hope was all throughout our school system. And very related to this, I love to emphasize that importance, as Mark's been talking about, of the board self-reflecting on its own performance. And so these pieces that are in here are also tied to aspects that come from research. Is the board doing anything that's negatively affecting the school district and the school's outcomes, right? So thinking at least once a year, are we supportive? Are we moving the right direction? Are we creating drama? Are we taking time and attention from the superintendent and other staff so that they're not on task because they're having to help deal with us and our situations? That's a really important area for school boards to consider for improvement. Again, so the board not only modeling the behavior they want, but specifically modeling that reflective practice idea, what we would hope that every teacher and principal and other people in the school system, even students, were saying, how am I doing? Am I growing? Am I continuing? Now, I might just add one thing. I know Debbie and the VSBA have different types of board self-assessments, but they have one that can be deployed electronically here based specifically on the standards. And, I think we would all encourage every school board across the state of Vermont to have at least once a year a self-assessment. How are we doing as a board? And some boards do that at the end of every meeting. How did this meeting go? Did everybody get a chance to speak? Was there anything not said? Did we waste time on some topics? Just a real simple assessment. And I've seen boards do that quite effectively in 2 or 3 minutes, take turns, different board members sort of leading that summary at the end of the meeting. And, a lot of good things come from that. Just personal growth as well as growth of the team.
And things like that, you can start off, especially if you have a lot of new board members or your board has gone through recent turmoil and you're trying to get back on your feet. Just do that for every meeting until it feels comfortable. And maybe after a few months or a year or a few years, you'd like, maybe we just need to do this every quarter. But it's always easier to back off things. It's nice to get used to doing it every time you do it and see how it feels. One other thing going back between, go ahead, Philly. I'm going into different thoughts, so finish that one up.
Well, near and dear to my heart, that 2.4 is the board learning together as a team and making it an intentional practice of the board. What do we need to learn more about this year? Do we need to better understand data, whether that's student achievement data or other data? Do we need to learn about what we need to do as a board to support improve student success? What is it that we need to learn about? And being very intentional. We used to, for years in school boards associations, we would recommend when you go to a conference or convention, divide and conquer, split it up, everybody go to different sessions, come back and talk about what you learned. Well, we've learned over time that really doesn't result in anything positive. If people come back, they compete, I got this idea, you've got that idea. We're talking over each other at lunch or dinner or at our next board meeting, and all excited about our thing. So what we've learned is a shared learning experience is really the key to ongoing improvement. We know this from systems theory that if people at the top of an organization are not learning and growing, the organization is likely stagnant or in decline. Some boards in Vermont used that book, Improving School Board Effectiveness, as a book study, but there was another one that's come out more recently that we really wove content from this into the standards as well, the Governance Core. And Davis Campbell, one of the authors, did a webinar for VSBA just a few months ago. Really solid content that, again, is just right alongside all these things in the standards about being clear in what your priorities are, functioning well as a governance team, and minding your manner is the way they phrase that. And I love the citing of George Washington's notes that he wrote when he was 16 years old. Roll not the eye kind of thing. Just really solid. So I just near and dear to my heart, and I think most people probably on the webinar is learning and growth and development. And if you want your students to be doing well, your teachers to be doing well, the board has to also apply learning and growth.
Yeah,
cut me off anytime I'm not too long, Mark.
No. I was just going to say that Governance Core is an excellent book. It's a fast read. I read it last year. I had it next to my bed. I think I read it before going to bed in the course of 3 nights. So a few hours tops, and it's very effective. It's very well written. So if anybody out there is interested, that is a great book to get a solid understanding of how a good school board can run. As far as learning, as Phil was saying, it's good to figure out what you don't know so that you can learn and be better at what you're doing. One of the problems is being overwhelmed. If your board hasn't been doing a lot of this, or you're new to the board, you might not know what you don't know, or it's just so overwhelming. There's so much that you don't know that it becomes hard to figure out where do we even start. Pick a thing. It doesn't really matter where you start. If you're coming into budgeting season, talk finance and have your business officer manager come in and talk about what they know. And then once you have a basic understanding, it's like, okay, I get that, but I'm still confused on this other thing. Or you've raised a new question I didn't even know was a question, and now I want you to come back in a month or next year or whatever it is and reflect on that. And it's going to be a slow process. And as you start getting comfortable with that one topic, introduce a new topic. Now we want to know how our literacy rates are compared to other testing across the state or the nation. We want to know about how facilities management is doing. Do we have a facilities management? So just build it. You're not going to, Rome wasn't built in a day. So don't feel like you have to have everything done before the end of the year. Just start building this into your goals that we had in priorities. And then to reflect back for priorities, 2.3 here says to evaluate the effectiveness of your community engagement. And one of the priorities was get your community involved. It's important to figure out, you might say as a board, well, we asked the community for their input. We didn't get any input. Oh, well, that's where we are. If it's not effective, then what you did didn't help you. So even though you had the best intentions and you put out the olive branch, try and figure out what the community wants, if they're not responding, then you need to go back to the drawing board under 2.3 and figure out, okay, well, what can we do differently to get effective? So it's not enough just to say, we put this program in place and we'll forget about it. There's a website, people can come and put in their comments about how they think the board is doing. And we get 2 comments a year. Great, that's it. Not enough. You got to come back and revisit and revisit and revisit. Move on to 3.
Governance processes.
There we are. So this is kind of more, how do you actually do all the things that you've set out in 1 and 2? If you have policies, however you want to define that, I know policy governance trademark is different than running a general policy board, is different than some other boards run, but you have certain statements that you work with, and you should be discussing, adopting, and revising them as they go along. Again, back from my local district, we just have them on a cycle. And so every 3 to 4 years, we will have revisited every policy that's in our system. And sometimes the policy committee will look at it and say, yep, we're happy with this and we don't think there's any changes. Other times, like maybe we need to adjust this, but that way we remember what our policies are, and it also makes sure that they're fresh and current. Going back to 2 and 3, when you're figuring out what your budget is, make sure that what you're budgeting for aligns with what you've said is important to you, and whether or not that those things that you think are important actually have a direct beneficial impact on your students. Everybody on your board should be aware of the various contracts that you have. Everyone on the board, even if they're not on the negotiating committee, should know what that committee negotiated on your behalf and knows what your teachers and your staffs are getting as part of employment in your district. That those 2 contracts, staff and teachers, probably make up 70 to 80% of your budget. So it's important to understand where that money is going and why you've made these agreements. We're talking here today because of a new statute in Vermont, and under that statute, governance happened. So that is impacting how boards react. So you should, especially during session, keep up to date on what's happening with Montpelier and your local select boards or councils, because they may be changing. Your property taxes, your grand lists are going to impact how your budget is going to be impacted on a town hall or a town meeting day vote. And know your local officials. So, because your school district and your municipality are all wrapped together, it's important to just have ongoing communication with the people around you who are also making other decisions, which may or may not impact your students, your faculty, your facilities.
Processes is really important. Most of us come to school board service from a trade background of some kind. There's some job or function that we do on a daily basis, whether we're a hairstylist or an attorney or a teacher or a welder. We're used to doing things. And we join the school board, sometimes, particularly former educators and people who come through PTA ranks. We want to roll up our sleeves and do things as a school board member. And governance and oversight is a lot different kind of doing, if you will. It's not those daily tasks of, making cookies or preparing lesson plans or, the things that we have experienced in our other areas of life. And while serving on a school board is like being on any other kind of board, it's also different than being on other boards. All to say, as new board members, if we think back in our first year or 2 of service, there's a lot of frustration with what we can and can't do. We're constrained by open meeting laws. We're constrained by a whole host of other laws, and we're sometimes constrained just by traditions and the way that things have always been done. So it's one thing I had to learn, and I think most school boards members have to learn, is that every single thing we do as a school system has a process. There's a process for policy adoption. There's a process for graduation requirements, setting graduation requirements, adopting curriculum. Mark's mentioned the budget. There's a whole big, sometimes convoluted, sometimes clear, but it's still a process to develop a budget. It's not like we just walk in and say, well, I want us to spend $500,000 more on this new curriculum. Like, no, it has to be vetted. It has to go through the process that our policies govern and that the laws constrain. And I don't know about, everyone, but myself and many other board members I've spoken to, it can be frustrating that we can't just do our thing. The task force included these words here: inclusive, transparent, and predictable. I love those words. I think they're critical to healthy governance. If you hear the statement about a school board, well, you never know what's going to happen at these board meetings. That's not a compliment, right? That's not a compliment. If we want the public to be engaged and involved and even informed about our work, they have to know what to expect, right? And so that predictability and the way we adopt policies and the way we set our budget and the way we handle discipline hearings or, grievances that come to the board, it needs to be sort of clear and obvious so that people can enter and understand what's happening. Certainly, the process for how your board receives community input, public comment during meetings, right? Like, what is that process? How do I say, what can I expect back? Will the board talk about my concern right there? Or are they going to talk with me later? Is somebody going to talk with me? Again, just all that importance of our processes being inclusive, transparent, and predictable, very important to a high-functioning school board.
Well, and this can relate back to the policies that was in the previous slide, where if your processes seem convoluted or they're not really doing what you want to do, that gives you a chance to go back and reevaluate the policy that underlines that process and say, well, is it convoluted because we're required by state or federal law to do it this way, and therefore it is what it is? Or has something changed since last time we looked at this policy that we can adjust it and amend it, and that policy can go before the board and be reevaluated and edited, and a new process can be derived from that change and allows the board to move with the times and how they want to do things. And then you don't have people angry at the process. You have a chance to look at the process. And as a general statement, although we've set out 4 to 6 subgroups under each of these 3 areas, those are not the be all end all. These are just kind of the base standard. We think any board should have these things, but your boards are unique to how your communities are developed and work together. You may see things that are not here that you really want to do or you're already doing, and that's great. But these are just sort of jumping off points.
I would underscore what Mark just said there at the end, that this whole set of standards was never intended to be comprehensive of all the things that board members need to know and be able to do. There are a lot of other things that school boards do day in and day out, every month in their work. Well, we tried to be, as a task force, very inclusive of those essential things, more of a focused set of standards, if you will, that we would hope every school board in the state would do. I want to go back just a moment ago, a couple minutes ago, Mark mentioned the idea of something here under governance processes that tied back to policies earlier. The task force did a really good job of knitting these standards together so that they do complement each other. And like anything, I'm sure this document could be improved, and folks through the years will find opportunities to improve it. That's fine. But the task force really was thoughtful in sort of making sure everything hung together and was mutually compatible and supportive. So it was a fun process last year.
It was.
The folks on the task force, many of them really did their homework, and right from day one contributed some great ideas to not only these standards, but for the follow-up to the standards. And I know we'll get to that in the next slide, Mark, that you have some things that that you were doing as a board, this was our hope, is that all school boards would find, how can we use these standards to help us in our governance?
The idea here is when you're sitting with your board, put into your agenda at some point that these governance standards are coming at you. You've got to figure out how we're doing it. And the first question is, are you doing these things? So it might be a self-evaluation, it might be just a discussion, maybe it's a retreat. Depending on how many people are on your board, you might break into subgroups and each group handles one of the sections, or if you're maybe just 5 of you on the board, you'll all do it together. And look through what those standards are and discuss amongst yourselves, what are you guys doing that's doing well? That you've got this. This is, you didn't know this was going to be part of the standard, but it's something that's already ingrained in how you've been doing your work. And I would say it's not enough to say, we're doing 1.4 great. Explain why. Explain to yourselves why you think that you're doing it well, what is going on there. Then for the reverse is, what do you need to improve? What aren't you doing, or what are you doing but it's not as good as it could be? Is there anything within any of the sections that you think is not really relevant to that section with how you run as a board, how your district operates? These are not chiseled in stone. You can move things around or tweak them as your district sees fit. And then is there something missing? Phil was just saying, this is not an all-inclusive. We try to keep it as open as possible, but there are things that might be very relevant to where you are or what you do that you really want to make sure your board has within its own local standards. And these are good places to start your board on this conversation, especially if this is the idea of formal governance is going to be new to how you do business. And like I said earlier, this is not something you're going to have finished by the end of the year. And even when these go into effect July 25, just like the open meeting law, there's no open meeting jail. No one's going to come and get you on July 2nd saying, sorry, you're not doing this. We're disbanding your board. It's just good processes for you to be thinking about and engaging with. So if there's stuff that's not going well or it's not doing, pick 1 or 2 and focus on that and build on that for 6 months or a year, and then just keep adding new things as you get more comfortable with the pieces that you're already engaged with.
Mark said something really important at the start on this slide, and this is an area that Debbie and the VSBA can help you with. Boards don't do enough to celebrate their own successes. And, just like putting together a jigsaw puzzle or walking into a partially finished room or something, you see what's missing. And it's easy sometimes to see what's missing, but look at all the amazing work that you have done and your growth and accomplishment. Your community needs to know, and certainly you need to know as a board, what are these shared areas of success? We used to do this and now we do this. Like Mark said, you're not going to go from 0 to 90 on a scale. You're going to take incremental steps. And I just want to highlight that importance of saying, what has our board done really well this year? And speak about those things publicly and privately, especially at a board meeting. Evaluating yourself, doing a self-assessment as a team, even just following 4 questions like this, really can help a board step to a new level of self-reflection, of continuous improvement. Again, I know the VSBA is right there, eager and able to help with this, but it's that what are these ideas that we should celebrate as successes? And what are 2 or 3 things we should work on this year to improve? Let's not try to work on 11 things because we won't be successful. What are the 2 or 3 things we really need to tackle? And then what's our strategy to address those? Are we going to do a book study? Are we going to bring in Debbie to facilitate improvement in that area? We're going to seek out some kind of learning or growth. Maybe it's even within the school system. And Mark kind of alluded to this several minutes ago, like when it comes time to the budget, do we need to meet with our business official and have a workshop for 2 or 3 hours to help us understand the essential components of budgets and tax rates and opportunities and limitations, if you will? What are those things that we need to know more about?
I just wanted to jump in here and let people know that the VSBA has put together a governance standards self-evaluation form, which will help boards answer those first 2 questions. And we will upload that to the handouts for this webinar today. You already have a tool that you can use right away to take a look at each of these standards and see how, as your board, you feel you're doing in terms of meeting each standard. So you guys did a great job covering this very well. I would love to use the remaining time to have people ask questions. I'm sure there are a number of them out there. I think, Carrie, you are keeping an eye out on the questions.
I have been monitoring them. I did answer one that I think it would be good to let everyone know, and that someone asked how they get the governance standards. And I wanted to let everyone know that with the follow-up email from this webinar, you'll get the governance standards as well as the form that Debbie just spoke about, and a copy of this presentation. And if you're watching this at a later date, you can find them on our website homepage or on the webinar archive page. At this time, though, we don't have any more questions that have come up.
I'm wondering if there's anybody on the webinar who was also a member of the task force, and if they want to add anything to this conversation.
Bill's here. If anyone would like to speak, go ahead and raise your hand and I can allow you to speak.
Yeah, Bill Edgerton was a great contributor.
Mike Inners.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael also, he had some really important input as well. And I see Eric Montrebian on the list. Also
Yes.
a very thoughtful contributing board member.
Doesn't look like anyone has anything to add at this time.
You guys did too good of a job.
Carrie,
Well, we
I saw
put
you,
everyone to sleep.
I see you have a question on policy governance that
Oh,
you know
sorry.
you probably answer.
There you go. Yep. I'd like to know if there's support for boards using policy governance. Debbie, I think you have an answer for that already.
There's an expert.
Oh, come on. Well, in the context of these standards, yes, there will definitely, as Mark or Phil alluded to, this is actually, I came from a policy governance board myself. And when I first saw these standards, the first thing I did was I ran to the policies of our board to see if we were meeting these governance standards. And that was a very interesting exercise to compare the policies to see if we were actually meeting these standards. And I have to say, it was quite interesting how aligned these governance standards are with policy governance principles and the policies themselves. So if that's what they mean by support, yes, of course, we're able to offer support to a PG board in the context of helping make sure that they are in compliance with these standards. But in generally speaking, we can also offer some support to boards that are struggling with policy governance. It is a complex system of governance, but well worth the investment of time. And when it's done right and well, it works very well. So we at the VSBA are discussing ways we can better support policy governance boards. Just contact me. I think I saw a question.
I think that's
raised
the
hand.
question that you saw. There
Oh.
are no more.
Debbie,
Okay.
I'll take a moment of personal privilege and just really want to commend the school board members in Vermont. I know hundreds of thoughtful, committed school board members across the state of Vermont. And it's not lost, very appreciative for what you do for your state, for your school children. And for those tuning into this webinar, either live or watching it after the fact, certainly, it's commendable of those that are interested in learning and growth and development. So thank you for an opportunity to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, then I guess we will end a little bit early today, but first I do want to thank both Mark and Phil for your participation in walking us through these standards so well. Did another question come up, Carrie?
Yes.
It always does. When we start the wrap up, somebody comes through.
Well, first of all, we had someone say thank you all very much. This is very, very helpful. I'm looking forward to see how the governance standards will help support all school boards and improve governance and student outcomes for all students. And then I had a question. Do you know what kind of rollout awareness campaign there will be for these standards? I'm curious to know how the public will learn about them.
I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, they just speak pretty much hot off the presses. AOE just put it on there. They've had the draft up there for months, but I think just in the past week, the actual approved standards are now available, and they're not going to be in effect for a year and a half. But I'm not sure what the thought is, whether VSBA is going to do something, whether boards themselves will present to their local communities, whether AOE will try and have something specific. Hopefully we will know in the future, or maybe we can put together something as VSBA if we don't think that's going to happen.
I can't speak for the AOE, but so I don't know what their rollout is going to look like or when it's going to happen. But I do know that VSBA, Phil started developing a curriculum for school boards to help bring them up to speed on these governance standards. And it's something that we are working on finishing. So there will definitely be support coming from our organization to school boards in the new year for sure. We'll probably have some webinars about the standards where we dig into the 3 different buckets and also be available to answer questions and offer some one-on-one support to whole boards as needed. So yeah, stay tuned for that.
It might also be a way for a board to deal with community engagement, is discussing what governance is and how this is going to impact the board going forward. Might be a way to bring at least one meet and greet with your community to talk about these things that are happening and how the board's going to react to these new standards.
A challenge for most school boards is the community doesn't understand what the school board's supposed to be doing. So parents and other community members come to the board, demanding you do this, do that, and things that are often outside of our control. I've long wished there could be some Schoolhouse Rock version of this is the role of a school board, and Bill sitting on Capitol Hill, whatever it is. But the opportunity there, that question sort of prompts is, how might local boards, in addition to the VSBA and maybe some other interested parties in the state, help get the word out about what school boards do and what they don't do, so that there's just greater understanding and perhaps support than for what school boards do.
I'd like to see you create that rap there, Phil.
Yeah. But I've got a little video, but it's just not catchy enough. It's not like Conjunction Junction.
That we all remember.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Scary to think.
Any last minute questions in the box there, Carrie?
There are not. I think we're ready to wrap up.
All right. So before we sign off, just a very quick couple of asks of all of you. Please take 2 minutes of your time after you leave the meeting to fill out the evaluation. We really do value your feedback. We read every single evaluation. They really help us to make these webinars better and to serve you all better. We also, as Carrie said, will be posting this recording of today's webinar and the handouts that we mentioned as soon as we possibly can. And next week, we have another webinar. A week from today, actually, it's going to be on the resolutions, the proposed resolutions for fiscal year 2024. So if you can join us for that, that would be great. They will be preparing members, VSBA members for voting at the annual meeting, which is taking place on October 26th, which as usual is part of our annual conference with the Vermont Superintendents Association. Speaking of which, in front of you, you have this visual to remind you that the registration is open for the annual conference. And we would really love to have you all join us, superintendents and school board members, at Lake Maury Resort on October 26th and 27th as we discuss the essential work of school boards and how that can impact student outcomes. So keep your eye out on the weekly updates that come into your inbox every Tuesday. And if you're not getting those, please let us know because every board member should receive them every Tuesday. And thank you all again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you again to Mark and Phil, and of course, Carrie for all her behind the scenes work. And I wish everybody a really great afternoon.